Welcome to everyone joining us today online for the third presentation this academic year in our ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Ranjana Basu, and I am an ASRI scholar. The Animals and Society Research Initiative is a research forum and working group at the University of Victoria for those interested in the critical examination of normalized practices and conceptualizations of human, animal, and interspecies relations. For information on other lectures in this year's series, please visit our website, and Holly is posting the link on the chat for you now, as well as an email address for ASRI if you'd like to join our listserv and stay up to date with monthly emails on news and events. We acknowledge the generous funding by the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for this lecture series. Thanks also to our co-presenter at the University of Victoria for this lecture, the Center for Global Studies. Today, we welcome Dr. Núria Almiron, presenting under the title Compass, Lobbying and Compassion, Interest Groups, Discourse and Nonhuman Animals. Dr. Almiron is a tenured professor at the Department of Communication at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, Spain. She is also co-director of the UPF Center for Animal Ethics there. Her main areas of research include and combine the ethics and political economy of communication, particularly interest groups and persuasive communication, with critical animal studies, climate change, animal advocacy, and interspecies ethics. Her work has been published in several academic journals, such as Climatic Change, Journal of Agricultural and Environmental Ethics, Environmental Politics, Journalism Studies, Environmental Communication, and the International Journal of Communication. She is the author and editor of several books in various languages, including Like an Animal and Critical Animal Studies, Approaches to Borders, Displacement, and Othering. She is currently the director of the MA in International Studies on Media, Power, and Difference, and coordinator of the research project Compass, Lobbying and Compassion, Interest Groups, Discourse, and Nonhuman Animals in Spain. Now, we will have time after her presentation for a question and answer period, so please post your questions in the chat, and I will try to order those and read them out. So now, with a warm welcome to you, I will turn the mic over to you, Dr. Almiron.
Thank you, Ranjana. Thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you also, of course, all the members of the Animals and Society Research Initiative for inviting me, Dr. Deca for inviting me, Holly Cecil for all the organization, and well, the rest of the members of this wonderful center. I really feel honored to be here. And well, it's an opportunity, a great opportunity for my team and myself to share with you this recently research-funded project that we have in our hands. So let me share my presentation. So, well, this session is to introduce all of you to our Compass project, and most of all to the context in which this project has emerged, since work on it is just starting now. And probably the best way to figure out where we are aiming at is looking at where we come from. So this is a presentation for giving the context of the project and also some explanations about what it is about. This is a research that was accepted last July and will be funded for 4 years. And well, first of all, because it is a team project, let me introduce the rest of the members of the team. We are a group of 12 researchers from 4 universities, Universidad Pompeu Fabra and the Center for Animal Ethics I co-direct, Universidad Pontificia de Comillas in Madrid, Universidad de Barcelona and the Observatory of Bioethics and Law, and Universidad de Dominio through also a Center on Politics and Society. All the researchers involved together, we gather expertise in communication, in critical animal studies, in animal ethics and psychology. The majority of us, we are senior researchers, but there are also 3 members that are PhD candidates, and I think the 3 of them are here in this audience, so thank you for coming. And also some of us have direct and professional experience in lobbying and advocacy, though I must say not against compassion, but for compassion. And in all cases, we have experience with animal advocacy. As for the animal ethicists in the team, we have Katia Faria, Efe Baez, and Fabiola Leighton. The psychologists in the team are Daniela Gualhorn and Antonio Nunez. And the rest of us, we are communication scholars working in the fields of influence, interest groups, advocacy, media discourses, narratives, marketing, and public relations. So what I will do in this presentation is first to introduce the theoretical framework of the project, which will also reflect our perspective. Second, I will provide a summary of some of the previous research that has most directly paved the way for this project, and which I think can illuminate the type of data and results we may obtain from our approach. I have to say here that I will show mostly research that I authored myself alone or with other communication members of the Compass team, because I am bringing to you the most direct context for Compass, which is not only the communication perspective, but also the crossroad of critical animal studies and critical public relations. And of course, it goes without saying that the work of the rest of members of the team in the fields of philosophy, psychology, marketing, etc., is of great relevance as well for the project. But I will here concentrate in what is most directly related to the singularity of Compass. That will be the first two parts of this presentation, and then the third and final part will be focused on specifically the main aims and expectations of the Compass project. So let's start. Compass is the acronym for Lobbying and Compassion, Interest Groups, Discourse and Nonhuman Animals. With this project, we aim to examine how the industry involved in animal exploitation attempts to curb the natural compassion of humans regarding animal suffering. That is, we aim at studying how much the industry's narrative and public relations action is interfering with the natural compassion of humans towards other animals. To do so, we are going to focus on the public communication of three industries involved in animal exploitation: the animal-based food industry, the animal experimentation industry, and the entertainment industry. In this case, the latter including zoos, thematic parks, aqua parks, circuses, and so on. Of course, for such an aim, we could look at the mass public narrative of the industries, which usually are reflected in their advertising messages. However, we aim to look at something less visible than advertising and much more under research, and also in our view, more influential than advertising. This is the narrative that the industry conveys through their public relations and public affairs activities. And this is probably what's the most relevant or singular trait of the project. And also, not only this, but what gives it its full, let's say, flavor to the project is the combination of three main theoretical frameworks and perspectives. The three main areas of our theoretical framework are, as you can see in the slide, interest groups, animal ethics, and communication ethics. And our perspective adds to these three approaches, the approaches of the perspective of critical public relations, critical animal studies, and the compassion approach. As for the animal ethics and critical animal studies, I do not think I need to convince anyone in our audience that non-human animals matter morally. Thus, I will simply skip this obvious issue. But let me mention here just what it means for us that we are merging, or that we have an animal ethics approach influenced by critical animal studies, because this may not be immediately clear to everybody. So in practical terms, our merging of animal ethics and critical animal studies means that our perspective points at three main drivers as the roots of our current relationship with other animals. These are capitalism, androcentrism, and speciesism. The critique of capitalism is an axis of critical animal studies, and this project acknowledges the fact that capitalism's origins are deeply rooted in the exploitation trait and ownership of other animals, just as the entire history of humanity has been since the so-called agricultural revolution, only that now with capitalism, or in modern times with capitalism, exploitation and abuse happen in a much efficient and massive way. As for speciesism, there is the idea of not assigning individuals of other species the same moral consideration we assign to human beings. Our starting point here is that this framework has no ethical grounding and is deeply entangled with our own suffering, and therefore connected with human inequality, power relations, and economic interests. And finally, our approach is also built to a large extent on research highlighting the gendered dimensions of our treatment of non-human animals. For instance, the claim that in Western culture, meat functions as a symbol of patriarchy as a result of a long-standing alliance with manhood and power. So far regarding our animal defense approach, but I think that here you may be more interested in the other two frames. That is, in what are these critical public relations and compassion approaches in order to figure out how they can contribute to animal liberation. So let's go first to the critical public relations approach. The study of public relations and public affairs related to industries involved in animal exploitation can be addressed in different ways. Here we do it from the interest groups theory, the area of research that addresses the role of interest groups in the shaping of public policies and public opinion in democracies. And by interest groups, we mostly refer to associations of individuals or organizations that, on the basis of one or more shared concepts, attempt to influence public policy and the public opinion in their favor. That is simply what we usually call lobbies. However, we also refer with this term to the public or private institutions that may not be associations of individuals or organizations, but work for the same purpose as lobbies. In many instances in agreement with lobbies, in other instances just for their sake. Here we refer to organizations like think tanks, the policy research institutes that go from very academic-oriented centers to purely propaganda-oriented actors, depending on who you look at. Of course, the legitimacy of interest groups as influential stakeholders is a major topic of discussion and of controversy. And to reach any conclusion here is beyond our project scope. We do not aim at Compass to address this controversy, but just to address the issue for the case of animal exploitation. And it is true that in the past, there was a trend to look at this topic with a dualistic gaze, either as considering lobbies and think tanks as mirroring the plurality of society, or as mirroring the power of the elites. But this is a simplistic view. It's a view that has been overcome because it's of little help. Reality is much more nuanced and less black and white. It is definitely true that the capacity of lobbying of corporate business and thus their capacity of influencing society is huge compared to that of non-profit organizations, like for instance, charities, NGOs, or social justice advocates. However, it is also true that not all interest groups out there are evil for democracy, as the examples I have just put, NGOs, charities, or social justice advocates who also lobby in democracy. But of course, it's absolutely true that some lobbies have a very real negative impact, mostly for-profit lobbies. So for our project, the important thing is not about whether all of them, all lobbies and think tanks, all interest groups have or do not have a legitimacy, but whether our studied actors, the lobbies involved in animal exploitation, have a legitimacy of becoming so influential. And of course, this is a rhetorical question because we think they do not have such a legitimacy. No type of violence probably can have any legitimacy to be promoted through discourse and policies. But to convince society, we need something else than our view. and providing evidences of the impact of interest groups on the natural compassion of people seems to us may produce such an evidence or at least contribute to. So the interest of compacts goes actually further than that. Interest groups are relevant actors per se for academic research. This is due to the fact that they have become very powerful generators of discourse and can play a major role in shaping society's perception, in this case, in our case, of our treatment of non-human animals. But also, this topic is of relevance and mostly for us, because interest groups are also key elements to understand the articulation of the animal-industrial complex, this so complex term that we use so often. And this is so because through interest groups is how corporate interest achieve its major discursive strength. And in this sense, it may be useful here to remember how lobbying is conducted mostly, because companies lobby through several channels, several mechanisms. In the first place, companies lobby through in-house lobbying departments when they can, mostly big corporations. That is, of course, direct lobby. This is only factual and likely for very big corporations who have resources and can have an impact by their own. Usually the impact is higher in association with others, but if you have resources, of course, you use all available means. The second way of lobbying for companies is through lobbying agencies, of course, by hiring public relation agencies that are specialized in lobbying. Lots of them are law companies, law firms. The third way of lobbying for companies is through individual lobbyists. That is, corporations may also hire external lobbyists, usually people who are former members of cabinets or former holders of high political positions and who keep a rich agenda of contacts in these political organizations they used to work for. And these are the three typical individual for companies ways of lobbying. But then we have the two other types which are the most important. Corporations also lobby by creating trade groups or business associations whose main aim is to lobby the political power on behalf of the whole sector or the whole industry. These are the organizations that we typically call lobbies, and they usually represent a relevant number of corporations from each sector or industry. And I would say all industries and all sectors are organized in this way. But we also have then what I call the umbrella lobbies. When the trade groups join in coalitions, that is in coalitions of lobbies, which of course have even more resources and power capacity to succeed in making their messages reach their target and persuade them. Note that not all interest groups' actions are directed to influence immediate policy decisions. Some are intended to gain access to policymakers or to create an atmosphere that will be conducive to the group in shaping future government policy. But it is particularly in the case of the creation of trade associations and coalitions of trade associations, the two in red in the slide, where the articulation of the conveyance and impact of the message and interest of the industries are optimized. And it is particularly through this capacity of organizing and influencing that interest groups contribute to the animal industrial complex. The animal industrial complex is, as I have said, a complex idea. It's an idea that Barbara Noske used for the first time in the late 90s, and that Richard Twine reviewed in 2012, introducing a rich analysis of it. A simple explanation of what the animal industrial complex refers to may be the capitalistic fabric in which the exploitation of non-human animals is embedded, and which nowadays involves much more than the food industry, but also all the other industries exploiting non-human animals, plus the political authorities actively supporting and perpetuating these practices with the assistance of the finance and media industries. Richard Twine alerted us of dealing with the term with caution, not to be fatalistic in our usages of it, but at the same time, not to underestimate what it points at. In this respect, it is useful to read Richard's words referring to the animal industrial complex. He said, on the one hand, the animal industrial complex concept points to relatively powerful alliances and networks in particular sectors of the global economy that strive to maintain a hegemonic position. It underlines how capital accumulation and resource control may become the overriding rationale in spheres such as global food production or military conflict, and how these relations are implicated and used as conduits for geopolitical strategies. And he ended, it could be a mistake, arguably, to overplay the degree of control that particular actors and actor networks are assumed to have. Richard Twain in this paper also alerted that the critical animal studies perspective, and I would add any other perspective, lacks a sophisticated understanding of how the complex endures across different regional, national, and global scales. This degree of complexity makes clear that a rhetorical concept of the complex, a rhetorical understanding of the concept, is wholly inadequate and needs to be radically strengthened with expertise from, Richard Twain says, sociology, science, technology, geography, or critical economy. I would add to this that to properly understand the animal industrial complex, we also need the expertise from persuasive communication experts, and more particularly from the field of public relations and influence communication, because it is precisely with these tools, the tools of public relations and interest groups, that the capacity of shaping reality of these industries can be better understood, mainly their capacity for creating discourse coalitions and knowledge networks, or very often pseudo-knowledge networks. At least, this is what we have found in our previous research. And thus I will move now to the second part of the presentation to provide a number of examples illustrating how critical public relations merging with critical animal studies and animal ethics can be useful. So first of all, let me start with the paper in which Laura Fernandez and myself argue for the incorporation of the animal standpoint into critical public relations research. The field of public relations is often related to solely materialistic aims, to profit, commodification, to the core of capitalism. And of course, there are lots of public relations professional efforts that confirm this thesis. And fortunately, in the academia, the bulk of research about public research has mostly public relations research has mostly attempted to serve this external reality. Therefore, teaching and researching with the main aim of helping optimize public relations as a tool to influence society, pretending to adopt a neutral stance that professionals of public relations usually verbalize as having no ideology, as if their work was only about the tools they use, like neutral professional PR tools, not about the results they obtain with these tools. Fortunately, there is also ethical professional public relations out there, and most important for us, critical research in public relations has been blossoming in universities since the end of the 1990s. In this regard, critical public relations has become a label pointing at research and reflection that instead of reinforcing the power involved in public relations, it rather challenges this power and challenges the dominant paradigm within PR teaching and practice. In this sense, critical public relations share with the rest of critical research in communication similar roots and aims. For instance, it is equally grounded in the critical theory of the Frankfurt School and in the idea that we need to challenge current assumptions, that we need to alter boundaries to produce paradigm shifts, that we need to produce a critique of mainstream theories, policies, and practices. In 2005, Judith Motion and Kay Weber clarified what this means in practical terms by saying that, quote, the task for the critical public relations scholar is to investigate how public relations practice uses particular discursive strategies to advance the hegemonic power of particular groups and to examine how these groups attempt to gain public consent to pursue their organizational mission, end quote. More recently, in 2016, Health and Schiffer stressed that the aim of the field of critical public relations is to go beyond the simple criticism of public relations and to aspire for a social critique that leads to human and social emancipation. Accordingly, Laura and myself, in this paper, we argue that human and social emancipation through communication practices cannot be undertaken if we continue to reproduce the species paradigm through these practices. That is, the positioning of humans at the very center of meaning, value, knowledge, and action. For us in this paper and in the whole Compass project, a real human emancipation is not possible without the suppression of all types of violence. And therefore, we encourage in this paper the field of critical public relations to endorse the critique of speciesism and the views of critical animal studies and animal ethics. We explain in this paper how this can be done through research and reflection on the areas of ethics, discourse, and political economy of public relations. And these are ideas also at the very roots of the Compass project, that embracing the animal standpoint in critical public relations is an essential step to furthering the study of power, hegemony, ideology, propaganda, or social change, and to accomplishing the emancipatory role of research, I would say, not only in PR, but in general. A number of ideas we provide in this paper with Laura, I have had the opportunity to put it in practice along with other researchers and obtain fruitful results with them. For instance, in my chapter, The Political Economy Behind the Operation of Other Animals, I focused on the agri-food industry in Europe. The agri-food industry has been particularly central in recent decades in political decisions that need social consent. In the EU, for instance, the Common Agricultural Policy has been reshaped to reduce environmental impacts, and some changes also have been implemented for so-called animal welfare in relation to cages, crates, and feeding. Of course, the essence of the current model of agri-food animal oppression has not been challenged in the slightest in Europe or elsewhere. But it is obvious that we need a change in values for a real shift towards an economic system free from non-human animal exploitation. And in this chapter, I argue that such a needed change in values is consistently contested by the interests of the economic elites, which use their substantial resources, political power, and communication skills to dominate or attempt to dominate the narrative and to shape policies. The question here is therefore, how does this exactly happen? The answer to this question is, of course, complex. It involves several variables. However, our object of study here is typically neglected, and it's a very relevant variable. This is the capacity of the economic elites for manufacturing social consent through their public relation resources and skills. In this chapter, I did not address pure lobbying, but the capacity of the industry to create what may seem scientific knowledge and the capacity for networking of the European agri-food lobby. This is called by previous authors as the knowledge interest nexus. There is the capacity to generate scientific knowledge, at least in appearance, which is serving a particular interest and which is able to be homogeneously spread by a network of actors. And why PR, public relations, when I say PR, I mean all the time public relations, has gone from just lobbying to a scientific knowledge facade? Well, simply because of the heavy reliance on scientific research of public policy and media discourse in the last half century. But this is not all. Research also shows the amazing networking capacity of the agri-food industry thanks to PR tools. The animal-based food industry has a high capacity of networking through transnational actor constellations and coalitions that, of course, produce in turn a higher capacity to influence policymaking, the media, and public opinion. Let's take, for instance, the Food Ring Europe as an example. The graphical constellation you have in this slide is the Food Ring's constellation of alliances. Food Ring Europe represents the interest of the food manufacturers in Europe, and of course, it is highly dominated by animal-based food industries within it. This is a coalition of organizations, an umbrella lobby, and this organization goes far beyond just lobbying through this constellation of influence. Food Ring Europe uses at least 3 types of tools for knowledge dissemination. The first one is the common provision of funds for research to academic departments, university research institutes, professional associations, policy institutes, and scientific think tanks. That is, the regular and well-planned funding of research, of course, of convenient research for this umbrella lobby. This is a funding of convenient research that it's also called the co-opting of experts in research. Second, the provision of expertise to public agencies and governments, media outlets, and public opinion through the supply of experts and scientific data is the second way these lobbies create knowledge. That is, making sure that the industry's interests are fully present in society, but not as a lobbying effort, but as an apparently independent expert voice. This is what we call co-opting of experts in public fora. And third, this umbrella lobby also invests heavily in education programs, particularly aimed at children and young people. These programs are often conducted in cooperation with or with the support of public agencies. This is possible, of course, thanks to the successful efforts of the 2 previous tools of knowledge dissemination, the experts' option in research and the experts' embedding in the public life. Bizarrely, no one sees a conflict of interest in the fact that the ones making food recommendations are the same industries that make profit from selling certain foods. This is just one example. All other lobbies invest heavily also in such tactics. Another example of critical public relations research is the examination I conducted in the case of the meat lobby in Europe regarding their tactics with climate change. I published this research as a chapter in Jason Hanna's edited book, Meatsplaining, in a paper titled Meat Taboo. Here, I specifically analyzed the meat lobby's strategy regarding the ecological footprint of meat to find out how much this strategy aligns with the strategy deployed by the tobacco and climate change counter movements. Those counter movements, if you remember, that Noemi Oreskes and Eric Conway defined as working within the logic of the merchants of doubt. In this paper, I particularly analyzed the communication strategy of the 2 main lobbies of the EU meat industry, the European Livestock and Meat Trades Union, the UECBV, and the Liaison Center for the Meat Processing Industry in the European Union, CLITRABI. Both are umbrella lobbies, that is, coalitions of sectorial lobbies. The first one, the UECBV, is the lobby group of the so-called livestock and meat industry. It includes the trade and market, slaughterhouses, cutting and preparation plants, the wholesale meat trade, and international meat traders. It represents more than 50 national federations from 24 countries in Europe, while the second one, CLITRABI, is the lobby group representing the interests of the European meat processing industry, including 26 national meat federations. And as you can see in the slide, they are having its next conference at home for me in Barcelona on May 22. In this chapter, I explained how the UMIT lobby mirrors the strategies of the tobacco and climate change counter movements by replicating two of their main strategies. First, by casting doubt on whatever is against their interest, on the impact of their business on climate change, on the impact of meat on human health, on the cruelty of their business, on veganism. Second strategy they use is capturing as much attention and initiative of public officers as possible to delay real change and to prevent all the stakeholders, like nonprofit organizations, from being influential. Therefore, this research identified a dual strategy, which is contradictory in terms. On one hand, the UMIT lobby adopts a pro-scientific greenwashing narrative to suggest that the industry cares for the environment and it's already investing in its improvement. In doing so, they build or try to build an image of we do care for the environment, and they add to this, we do care for human health and we do care for animal rights. But on the other hand, and simultaneously, they step up lobbying efforts to protect corporate interests by blocking real policy action. These results align with previous findings with Nathalie Gazal in our research of the vivisection animal experimentation industrial complex. My next example. It is well known that the entire span of animal research from captivity to death causes immense suffering for hundreds of millions of non-human animals every year. Thanks to the work of animal advocates, the public is increasingly aware of this suffering and deeply disturbed by it, as surveys show everywhere, every year. Shockingly, in response to this increasing awareness, the vivisection industrial complex lobbies more reinforces actually their lobby against animal welfare regulation and animal rights activism. In this article with Professor Gazal, we discuss how the political economy of the vivisection industry supports the species business of animal testing by mimicking the language of animal welfare to increasingly obstruct the public's compassion. What we did was to conduct a political economy analysis of the industry and a discourse analysis of the messages of their main think tanks. We showed that the animal experimentation business is an industrial complex. Here, the term vivisection or animal experimentation industrial complex designates different types of organizations and businesses whose source of funding depends on or is related to using non-humans for research. The organizations that form the vivisection industrial complex are mainly of three types. They can be public or private companies directly conducting or commissioning animal testing, mainly pharmaceutical, but also chemical, cosmetic, tobacco, the governments. They can also be academic institutions, universities, research labs, medical schools, etc. And they can be also suppliers of animals for research and of related services besides animal testing, such as providing organs, instruments, and training. It is noteworthy to mention that governments are major players in this industrial complex as well. They are major players through their direct involvement in animal testing and their indirect involvement through research funding, public universities, defense, and so on. Not the least, governments also impose regulations to test products and substances for human consumption, like drugs, chemicals, and cosmetics on non-humans before marketing. Cosmetics not anymore in the EU, but in the rest of the world, this has not changed. So if we take into account the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is mostly owned by investment funds, and thus it is in the hands of the finance system, we can clearly see how this business involves the three key actors for an industrial complex to be formed. There is the industry itself, the governments, and the finance sector. In our analysis in this paper, we showed how the think tank's narratives, the think tanks connected to the vivisection lobbies, reinforced the notion of human supremacy and are and were instrumental in building a discursive network of support for this notion. At the same time, we detected a contradictory narrative, like in the previous example. Here, the industry recognizes the problematic nature of its business and is forced to emphasize animal welfare concerns, but at the same time, they dismiss their ethical dilemma and justify their practices. From this research, we can easily note how critical public relations allows us to draw the bridges between capitalism and speciesism more empirically, not just in a rhetorical manner. That was also illustrated by another example of research, this time on the aquatics tools lobbies, or as John Denayer called, the aquaprison business. In this case, the paper I am commenting is Slaves to Entertainment. And this paper is showing how PR has historically manufactured consent for orcas in captivity. Orcas in captivity is a relatively new phenomenon with an easily traceable history. In this paper, I show how critical public relations can be used to illustrate the perpetuation of speciesism according to the theory of oppression. This theory was described first by Donald Noel in 1968, but later adapted by David Niebuhr to speciesism. The theory of oppression refers to the fact that the exploitation and oppression of other animals is conducted following a three-step pattern. First, because of competition for resources. Second, because of economic interest of an elite. And third, because ideological conditioning for obtaining the social rationalization and legitimization of the previous human actions. The human abuse of orcas perfectly exemplifies the three factors of the theory of oppression. First, in this paper is shown how our perspective of whales, and more particularly of orcas, was initially driven by the competition for resources. Orcas were first seen by whalers as fishing competitors, and because of this, they were demonized and called killer whales. Killer whales, which actually is a wrong translation from a Spanish expression from Basque whalers, who were among the first whalers in the world. Second, orcas were later discovered as fascinating, majestic beings, interesting for entertainment purposes and thus exploited for economic interests. And third, the paper shows how PR tactics were used by the elites to manufacture consent for both narratives, with, in particular in the paper, an emphasis on the aquaprison industry and how ideological conditioning was constructed by this industry's public relations arms to legitimize the exploitation of orcas in modern times. Of course, this can be applied to the rest of non-human animals captive in aquaparks and in all types of zoos. But here the story, the narrative I'm building for you is the one that I built for the paper, and it's focused on the orcas history. So this industry has been forced, probably more than any other industry, to constantly invest on washing campaigns without being able to stop the progressive erosion of its public image, particularly since the documentary Blackfish was launched. The aggressive PR reaction of the industry against this documentary is also illustrative of the need for critical animal studies research to focus on communication and public relations to illuminate how power and oppression is articulated. And finally, let me just comment on two works recently published by Miquel Rodrigo and Jose Antonio Moreno and myself on the role of think tanks in the diet discussion. In Manufacturing Ignorance, we studied more than 100 top think tanks in Europe. We wanted to know whether European think tanks had discussed animal-based diets regarding climate change policies and mitigation actions. To this end, we conducted a frame analysis on the discourse of these think tanks and found that, with a single exception, there isn't a real discussion. Actually, the attention paid as a whole was just ridicule. For these reasons, we conclude that think tanks in Europe had and are contributing in reality to manufacturing ignorance rather to any sort of discussion regarding the impact of the animal-based diet on the climate, at least to say on ethical issues. It must be noted that the sample of organizations include top policy research institutes in Europe. As for the reasons why they have not been able to deal with the link, well, we point at ideological reasons related to economic, anthropocentric, and patriarchal worldviews. Here, the single relevant exception was British think tank Chatham House, with one of the best analyses on the impact of animal-based food on global warming. However, as for the rest, the summary was that think tanks are mostly man-driven, pro-industrialist, androcentric, and speciesist places. In the second paper, and final example of my list, in this case with Jose Antonio Moreno, we addressed the debate about the meat tax in the UK. The graph in the slide is showing the both sides of this apparent debate, the for and against the tax, the meat tax. However, after carefully looking at it, we concluded that the debate about the meat tax in the UK was not really a debate between two sides, but just a reaction by the meat industry with the support of the conservative political class and a bunch of neoliberal think tanks and climate obstructionists. Their message was and is magnified by the fact that it is very homogeneous, even though we cannot identify a PR campaign behind. However, we can identify how the role of think tanks, even if only a few of them, was particularly relevant since they worked as the expert voice in the narrative against the meat tax. Overall, these findings and other that preceded our project have shown that there is a lot of potential for critical animal studies and animal ethics in the merging with critical public relations. But they also show the need to attend to influence and interest from a communicative perspective to better understand how the animal industrial complex works, to turn this abstract concept into a concept much more specific and fuller of meaning, and not just a term used to criticize animal exploitation without a clear understanding of what it involves. This is something that was claimed actually by Richard Twain in the paper I have mentioned from 2012, and that we fully endorse this claim. So from the roots, from all these roots, the Compass project was grown, though with a specific added trait, because the Compass project focused on lobbies and think tanks involved in animal exploitation, but in the fact that we look at particularly how they are curbing compassion. And why focusing on compassion? What do we mean with compassion? In this respect, our compassionate approach departs from the affirmative view of compassion by Martin Nussbaum, who considers compassion not as an irrational emotional, rather a moral one, a prosocial behavior, a response to the suffering of others and a willingness to alleviate it. Therefore, as a prosocial mindset and a proactive behavior against suffering, cultivating compassion can be seen as progress towards a more ethical society. Accordingly, blocking compassion can be seen certainly as ethically problematic. Adopting compassion as our lens for interest groups and animal exploitation is a rather unusual way of approaching empirical research. Animal exploitation is usually researched with a view centered on justice, rights, interests, Also, interest groups are far from being connected to compassion in PR research. We also consider this lens as interesting because it goes beyond the usual androcentric kit of values. Compassion promotes care instead of justice, or if you prefer, it can be seen as guiding justice. Actually, in this respect, Nussbaum asserts, quote, compassion is not the entirety of justice, but it both contains a powerful, if partial, vision of just distribution and provides imperfect citizens with an essential bridge from self-interest to just conduct, end quote. Nussbaum also states that compassion is a moral compass because it involves the recognition that the situation matters for the flourishing of the person in question. For us, as for Nussbaum, compassion is a distinctively moral emotion. Compass, our project, is going to test what can we get from research fully oriented towards this moral basement in the case of animal suffering and lobbies. In this context, our general goal for the project is to examine to what degree interest groups contribute with their discourse to curb compassionate action with respect to other animals in society, thus contributing to justify and continue our current relationship with non-human animals. By compassionate action, we mean both passive and active action. Passive action, not contributing to any action that may interfere in the well-being of other animals, and active action to actively contribute to increase the well-being of other animals. To fulfill this goal, we aim at studying the messages spread by a number of lobbies and think tanks in the case of Spain related to three industries, as I mentioned it at the beginning: the animal-based food, animal experimentation, and entertainment. Entertainment meaning mostly animal exhibition facilities, because these are the three industries that use the largest number of animals of all industries and whose revenues are more directly dependent of this exploitation. We have chosen Spain for logical reasons because we are mostly settled in Spain, but the network pattern in which the industries work and the EU policy umbrella behind where they act mean that messages and strategies are very similar, if not a replication everywhere in the EU. For the analysis, we will look at the messages, at their network capacity, at their links with capitalism, speciesism, and androcentrism, and at their contradictions. But that's the most important thing. We will do so through our main lens and final goal: how much the interest groups are working to curb the natural compassion of humans towards other animals. And from this, we expect to first increase our understanding of the evolving traits of interest groups in democracies, of how to unveil their illegitimacy when violence and oppression is involved, when moral discrimination is involved. Second, we aim at understanding how interest groups discourse and other animals are connected not only with capitalism, but also with speciesism, hegemonic masculinity, and other patriarchal pressures. Third, we aim at contributing to the raise of moral awareness regarding non-human animals within the research and practice of public relations. Fourth, we aim at increasing our understanding of discursive networks and the shaping of public opinion in the area of compassionate behavior. And finally, we aim at increasing our understanding of human inaction toward non-human animals suffering and discrimination. And here I finish this presentation. I hope this journey through how this project has been conceived and what it's about and what we expect from it has been of interest to you. And thank you so much for your attention and your attendance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Almiron. That was so interesting, and it's such an exciting project. So we'll open things up now for a question and answer session, and maybe I'll just start off with a question. I'm so interested always in praxis, and wondering if you see any opportunity through your project for animal rights groups and environmental groups to work together.
Yes, well, in fact, when we look at profit lobbying, we are always somehow giving tools for non-profit advocacy, because we are attempting to unveil their weak points, the way they work, how they articulate. So it should be easier. It's always very difficult, but it should be a little bit easier to understand how dismantle their narratives. So in doing so, of course, we always have in mind animal advocacy in the end, because our goal is not criticizing for-profit animal exploitation lobbies, and period. Of course, we do that with the aim of helping animal advocacy, because if you somehow dissect how this profit complex exploiting animals works, it should be easier for animal advocacy to counteract their narratives and their strategies. Of course, there will be always this huge disadvantage of resources in comparative terms, but I always say that we have on our side ethics, and there are no resources and money that can worth and equate this.
Right. Thank you. There's a question from Kishore Dare. Would you like to comment on the role of animal industrial complex in China, Russia, and the Islamic world?
Wow. Well, I have never done research particularly in these areas, just because I think we should work on the areas we live in. We are embedded in their cultures, we know their languages. So English is the furthest I achieve, but for these other regions, I have never conducted any sort of research directly, just read and of course know how they are. And well, particularly Russia and China are very problematic. In China, there is a growing animal advocacy movement, but there is also this huge effort by the government with only capitalist and economic oriented motivations, which has nothing else into account, which is very negative for the lives of so many animals. So it's a very difficult country. Russia, so far as I know, it doesn't have such an animal advocacy movement as in China, so it's even more difficult. For instance, in the case of the aqua parks, the aqua prisons, the whales and the dolphins in captivity and all those animals in those places, Russia has become, and China as well, but Russia particularly, a place where the industry is flourishing, while in Europe or in the US, the industry is under constant attack by not only animal advocates, but by also some clever media. That is not happening in Russia or China. And currently those countries are the ones owning the largest number of whales, for instance, in captivity for exhibition purposes. And it's very difficult to have any data about exactly what they are doing, where the animals are, what are their conditions. If it's something which, even in our countries, in Western countries, in the European Union or the US, for instance, it's difficult. It's much more difficult in China or Russia. So I only can say that these are very, very problematic places for animal ethics, yeah.
Okay, great. Another question from Manisha. Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. Can you say how Compass will measure the curbing of compassion, and what is the primary methodology?
A wonderful question. I cannot answer it right now. We are just starting and we are building the tools. But this is exactly, I didn't want to be very technical, but yes, actually we are now focused on defining first what do we consider as lobbies and think tanks, what we consider as discourse from these entities, because of course discourse is easy to pick up from media, for instance, but what is discourse from a lobby? So we have to define this. We have to, of course, define how to measure the promotion or prevention of compassion through discourses. We have also to decide on how to analyze what is and what is not a network or a coalition, how to measure the impacts of capitalism, speciesism, and androcentrism. So we have some clues because of the previous research, but in general, the previous research, even there was one paper that was talking about compassion, but actually there was no empirical methodology. So all the research I have shown is not applying the compassionate lens as we are going to do it. So we have to build all these tools. So that's why I didn't go in depth into it, but that's a challenge, and we are now just on that. Yes.
Another question from Kishore is, what is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and the zoonotic diseases on the role of the animal industrial complex?
Wow, this is a very, very general question. Well, there is a link because zoonosis has been explained as diseases coming from non-human animals, or diseases that can be transmitted from animals, human animals to non-human animals, the opposite. This is how zoonosis is traditionally defined. And of course, there are some industries that have been more or less alerted of their discourse to be shaped according to this now common knowledge issue, which is zoonosis, which was something that people didn't know about it like 2 years ago, or a few people knew about it. However, this is a very problematic topic for me, because I need to learn more about. What I know so far is that there is an area which is totally under-researched, which is probably more important than the typical zoonosis that we have been talking about, related to the exploitation of animals in farms and having those non-human animals there under such poor conditions that they are easily contagiated by diseases coming from outside. Also, the loss of habitat for animals in nature also being a trigger, a driver for zoonosis to develop. All this is something that I need to research more, because when you look at the papers, and we have been doing that, actually we have been doing this at the Center for Animal Ethics, and surprisingly, my final, well, not conclusion, but insight was, well, that's not so clear how it works. But there is something which is almost not discussed, and which is very clearly probably the most important place where we bridge the species, the species gap is bridged the most, and these are laboratories. Because in laboratories is where tissues, fluids, and all sort of corporal stuff is mixed among different species. And then, for instance, for manufacturing vaccines. And these are places that are probably more likely that zoonosis or those sort of contagious spreads start. But you cannot read anything at all about this anywhere, because there is such little information. These places usually are under strict control of security, all people working there signing confidential agreements. It's very difficult to know what's going about in these places. But well, a very difficult topic. I cannot go more inside this because of the limitations I have just expressed. I don't know enough. I think there is not enough research done. I think there is a lot of like superficial gossip around this and not enough deep research conducted on what exactly means zoonosis, what exactly is happening within those laboratories that we don't know, and how this compare with the risk of zoonosis outside in nature or farms. I'm sorry for not being clear about, but it's a very complex topic.
Thank you. And another question is, so thank you, Dr. Almiron, for your insights in this lecture, and congratulations on the progress of Compass. You mentioned the documentary Blackfish in your presentation, and my question is to ask if you could share your perspective from Spain, if there are comparable documentaries there providing a voice for animals and to counter the animal entertainment industry lobbying. With your 2016 book, Critical Animal and Media Studies, and the influence of visual media on public opinion, do you see that being used as a tool in Spain by interest groups, either for or against animal compassion?
Sure. I think it should be used everywhere, and it's being used everywhere. In Spain, there are a number of documentaries made in the last years. We have a list of documentaries in our website at the Center for Animal Ethics, which is very updated, and we have there the most, we think, anti-speciesist and for animal advocacy documentaries. And sure, there are a couple, 3 or 4 excellent documentaries that have been launched in the last 3, 4, 5 years in Spain. But elsewhere, I mean, also in the US, in the rest of Europe, the key thing here is how to make a blackfish. I mean, blackfish, the impact of blackfish is something that is really unusual. And it's probably because a combination of factors that it's very difficult to control. The documentary was very good in terms of how it pointed to a particular industry, to a particular corporation that was also easy for them to build a more clear narration that not just criticizing in general. Probably the tools they used, using people who were former collaborators of the abuse and who have turned into animal advocates. This is always a very useful technique, and not just a technique. These people is real, but I mean, using these people, what we call converters, is a very good strategy because it's what touches people, the audience who are not convinced, and see that those people thought as they are thinking now and they have changed their mind. So it's a very good documentary that applies very good strategies. But exactly why they had such an impact, it's very difficult to know. So I would say we have just go on trying, making good pieces of work, and trying, because also you need to touch and to address all the angles, all the perspectives in the audiences. And the audiences are not homogeneous. The audiences, of course, include people who are already very convinced about animal ethics, and people who are at all convinced, and in the midst you have all sorts of stages. So every piece of documentary can have more or less impact depending on the audience. So we just have to keep on producing good documentaries everywhere for all the different audiences, adapted to the different publics, and just try to do a good job and work in coalition with the other animal advocate groups in our areas, not struggling with them, but in coalition and coordination, and just keep our efforts going on, and other blackfish will appear. There are some other documentaries that we cannot measure their influence, because the influence of blackfish has been empirically proven because the SeaWorld company has been so enraged and created such a campaign against, and they have been forced even to stop somehow orcas performing, though not completely, but it's visible. But in other cases, it's not so visible, but there is a very, very profound impact as well. So yes, just everywhere. I cannot recommend any particular documentary for Spain. I just recommend go to our list of documentaries there because it's very complete. We update it regularly, and it's not just for Spain, but for all the documentaries we have knowledge about, and we know that they are abolitionist in their aim and not welfarist.
Thank you. Another question from Manisha. With all the expertise you have, what do you think of the current emphasis on reducing consumption of animal foods as opposed to eliminating them and promoting full plant-based diets? Do you think the reduce discourse and even the focus on emissions rather than animal suffering are an industry strategy in the end?
Yes. Well, on my view, these are not the best strategies possible. I think maybe you can have an impact in the short midterm, but I don't think you have an impact in the long term with this sort of strategies, like the revolving meat on Monday, or I don't know, being flexitarian or these sort of things. I think you can only have real and persistent change when the shift is made based on ethics. That's something that it's proven once and again in research. And that means that the rest of things, doing it because it's trendy, or because it's important for your health, or it's because it's important for the environment, in the end is where we see the largest number of people who come back to the previous diet and are not able to stay in it. So I don't think these are the best strategies at hand. But that said, I understand that in some occasions, some groups think that that's the single thing that can have some impact in where they are working or among their audiences. I don't think I could do it, but I understand they do it. And I think you can do that and still be an abolitionist, just understanding that this is just a step forward and that there is another step after this. And at the end, you achieve the abolitionist goal, but I don't think I could apply it myself, for instance. But I understand. I don't think it's the best strategy. I understand they do it. I understand that NGOs, animal NGOs, in some places, they are just exasperated because change is so slow, and they just change and try other ways of working. There are some examples. I have some examples in mind, but I'm not going to comment them because I understand their trouble, and I don't think I know more than them. They are there on the street working. So my feeling is that the single strategy that works long term is ethics, and ethics cannot be step by step. I mean, you cannot just kill a little bit someone. You kill it or you don't kill it. But I don't criticize the NGOs that do that at all, never. I just don't share their strategy, but I don't criticize it. I don't know if I'm answering. It's really difficult issue.
Carrie Freeman has her hand up. I'm sorry if I didn't see that earlier. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Please, Carrie.
Oh, hey. Oh, put my video on. Thank you so much, Núria, for this presentation. Like I know I follow a lot of your work, but I learned some new stuff, and I really want to say what a mark you're making in studying corporate discourse in promoting, animal exploitation. And I think you're making such great contributions with you and your PhD students and your fellow scholars. I wanted to have you comment a little bit more about public relations, because I've tried to use PR literature to help in terms of animal advocacy, but so much of PR literature in academia is corporate. Like it assumes that you're advocating for corporations, and that's fine. And sometimes it is fine, but they also portray activists as like this pesky, bothersome public that you have to deal with, instead of thinking, no, activists are doing PR. And so, and I think critical PR is a new field. And like, so are you, anyway, I just wanted you to speak to that, because I feel like for those of us who teach communications, that's a real, I don't know, it's a real disconnect that they don't really have that normative, that ethical aspect. They're more about corporations like trying to be truthful or not being too selfish, but they're not really thinking about like how to help nonprofit groups or marginalized counter-hegemonic groups use public relations.
Yes, maybe we can exchange in the future the literature, because I'm sure you have some literature that I don't have. Yes, 99% of the literature in this field is thinking for profit and corporate business. There are some that try to embed some ethics, and that I think they are quite useful, though in the end they are for profit, but there are some list of ethical recommendations that they're useful. And then there is this critical public relations issue, which actually they were born in the late 1990s. So they have like 2 decades behind them. And I discovered them like 5 years ago, no more than that. And it's probably because they are a few people.
Right.
They started as long as yes, as I know, they started in Scotland, actually, around some universities there, and it's a small group, but these people have been producing really another type of public relations reflection, which of course has no animal advocacy at all embedded, but it's thinking for nonprofits. And that's why I think it's so convenient for them to also open to the animal rights and animal interests, because they are so close already. And actually the publication I start with, the critical public relations encouraging, in the first publication with Laura, it's within a journal which has these stands, probably the single journal with these stands. And they were somehow wanting this approach because they identified that this was something that was interesting for them. So very interesting approach, very interesting people, very small, but some publications that I can share with you if you want, that are relevant for nonprofit. No mentions to animal advocacy, but for nonprofit they are relevant. But yes, it's super difficult in our field but that makes it more interesting, I think.
Yeah, that's a way that we can make a difference to the literature there.
Yes, and I don't know you, but my students in the public relations track, they are very open to all criticism, to rights, animal rights, human rights, to everything. Probably because during the whole degree, they have so much corporate that when you produce something it's a little bit different, they like, yes, that's possible. And I always try to bring to the classroom, but I'm not teaching anymore in the undergrad, but in the undergrad and also in the masterclass, I try to bring non-profit advocates, professional. There are professional non-profit lobbyists, not a lot of them, but there are some of them. And they are excellent examples for the students.
We've come to the end of our time for the question and answer. So I wanted to thank you, Dr. Almiron, so very much. And also to the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for funding for this lecture series. Thanks also to our co-presenter at the University of Victoria, the Center for Global Studies. And next up in our Distinguished Lecture Series is the online presentation, January 19th, by Dr. Maria Elena Garcia, presenting under the title, Landscapes of Death, Political Violence Beyond the Human in the Peruvian Andes. And you can pre-register for that on our ASRI website, following the link provided at the top of the chat. So in closing, just a very big thank you to Dr. Almiron for this excellent presentation and talking about this very exciting project.
Thank you so much, and congratulations for this so interesting series.
That's great. And finally, thank you all for joining us today. It was really a very wonderful event.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.